Hello, Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online podcast. This is going to be episode 289 of our regular shows, and we're recording this one on April 26th, 2025. This is the official podcast for the fan site, AvatarTheLastAirbender.online.com, and I'm going to be your main host, Morgan Airspeed Prime. Joining me on the podcast is Greg2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Excellent. So, on today's show, our main topic, when we get to it a little bit later on, is going to be, we're getting back to our Avatar and Korra rewatches, so we're going to do some episode reviews. This time out, we've got 3 episodes to cover, 2 from Avatar, 1 from Korra. We're going to be doing 215, The Tales of Ba Sing Se, 216, Appa's Lost Days, and on the Korra side of things, we're going to be doing K302 Rebirth. But first of all, we'll get into the news. Apart from, like, the 2 main things here, really not that much has happened over the last couple of weeks. It's been a little bit of a kind of dead period here, just waiting for stuff to happen. But we will get into some of this stuff here. So, first of all, we'll lead off with what happened a few weeks ago, and almost the idea that, hey, we didn't rush to do a podcast straight away after CinemaCon because basically nothing happened. Now, technically, we did get news, but it was so kind of, in general, disappointing. There was almost like no need to jump and just do a podcast straight away. So we'll cover CinemaCon from a few weeks back. So we went in expecting news because it appeared at the event the last few years. We got something, but it was not really what we expected. So what news we got for the Aang movie from CinemaCon is, yes, we did in fact get the finalized title. And it is The Legend of Aang, The Last Airbender. That's confirmed as the official title for the movie. Apparently, at the panel, or whatever, the showcase, they did show the audience the logo, but the logo was, of course, not released online. So we have no idea what it looks like, but I'm guessing it is just literally the text logo, Avatar style. We got the small bit of information that's maybe the most interesting thing that came out of the event, which is that apparently the movie actually wrapped up animation production the week before CinemaCon. So that's about a month ago at this point. So that's kind of crazy, but it also speaks to, if you're that far into production, why aren't you saying anything really? But it was a nice production update to get that. Oh, like they've done the main gist of like the production. There's obviously still final stages and stuff like that, but that's good to know that it doesn't seem like the movie's in production trouble necessarily. They did mention Steven Yeun, but they didn't say who he's playing. So that was one of those ones where it was like double, triple spoiled like ahead of time to the point where that wasn't really news. And really that's it. I'm not even sure if they actually said the January 30th date at the convention, or if that's just websites or people saying that that's what it is based on the last we heard of it. So I'm a little unclear if they actually relay the date again. But that's it. A bit of a weird showcase. Probably the SpongeBob SquarePants movie, which is out the month before the Avatar movie. It kind of got the presentation we expected, where they put out some visuals and stuff like that. They talked more about the actors. But for some reason, it was a little bit too early for this movie. But what are your thoughts on the info that we did, or I guess didn't get here from CinemaCon?
Yeah, I definitely can understand a bit of like disappointment in like, wanting to get more information, since that is sort of where we've tended to seen it get from there. Granted, it is sort of like a close event, so, officially we don't really technically should get that much from it other than sort of the basic information, but it definitely feels like this time we even got less than normal, and we're even closer to when, the presumptive sort of date of it actually coming out actually is. So yeah, I don't know. It's interesting that they're, definitely sort of holding back on this. I don't know if they're just trying to gather up attention, but I don't know if that's necessarily the best way to go about it, since, us, we're sort of following people who are sort of into it, but a lot of other people, aren't as aware of, the back and forth of things.
Yeah, so the big thing here, I think, is mostly the discussion about like the title. We finally got it, but is it a good title or not? It's, in my opinion, it is a very, very functional title, but I don't think it's a particularly great title. Like, I can see why they've gone for this, but you can sort of tell that it's it's almost a desperately put together title, because it's like, well, we're so close to the James Cameron Avatar movie. Can we really call our movie Avatar? Are we even allowed to do that with a movie? So they kind of maybe want to lean away from that. But then they're kind of like, if we just do Aang the Last Airbender, is that enough? Is it too similar to something else? So let's just mash all the different titles together, where it's like the international title, like Legend of Aang, but it's also The Last Airbender, just removing Avatar. So it's a weird one, but I guess it uses a lot of the stuff that people will recognize in terms of like, oh, Legend of Korra, Legend of Aang. So many countries will know the show as Legend of Aang already. It's got The Last Airbender in it. That's cool, but also it still doesn't tell us anything about the plot other than that it's an Aang movie. And yeah, just this coming out with no visual, we don't even get to see the logo that was shown, is very odd. But specifically, what do you think about the title now that we like officially have it?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it definitely is, I guess you could say it is rather, sort of plain in the way that they're sort of going about it. It definitely, like you're saying, it doesn't really speak to much, even if, there's ideas of what could potentially be sort of in the movie itself. But yeah, I don't know. Usually I feel like when you do get sort of like a colon title, it's usually a bit more sort of like descriptive of what it actually is, or, it has like some sort of like buzzword attached to it that really gets it, sort of going and hypes up about it, even if you still don't have any clue what it is about. So it definitely feels like this isn't, sort of the most interesting title they could have come up with. But yeah, I guess if they're really trying to avoid any sort of comparison or, whatever with, the other Avatar movie, I guess this sort of works with it. I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe they could have thrown it at the end just to have it in there. I mean, there's all these other words attached to it. So, like, are people really going to, like, confuse it in that sort of way or anything like that? Or is it really just a copyright legal sort of thing, which I get it. No, you don't want to battle Avatar. That's, probably a losing battle as far as that goes. It's just unfortunate for those of us who've grown up with having the Avatar name in it.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Like with Korra, we're used to an official title not having Avatar in it, I guess. We kind of expected this to a certain degree in the sense that it was sort of a surprise that Seven Havens actually has Avatar in it, and it's not like Avatar Legends, which I think we were all preparing ourselves for. I think it's a title where you can tell they probably went through like a million iterations. The fact that like we have all these rumors of titles like Lost Realms, Hidden Kingdom, Aang the Last Airbender, and there's probably every iteration without Avatar. They probably did use Avatar Legends at some point. Like this was a big thing for like a franchise kind of relaunch to get the titling right, and I guess with the movie being very kind of Aang focused, this was the right way to go with it. Frustrating, but it is what it is. So after that, a lot of disappointment, and then just a few days ago, we had what seemed to be a pretty good sense of hope, because the next event coming up is, of course, Annecy Film Festival 2025, which is happening kind of early to mid-June, so like the month before San Diego Comic-Con. So it's the big kind of animation film festival, and we've had news from here before, the weird 2022 General Fong's Fortress, like they showed something about like Earth symbol. We still don't have a clue what that really was, but they've shown stuff about Avatar here before, so we were expecting it. And then a lot of news articles came out. Here's the full lineup of basically the Annecy Film Festival. And then you scroll down towards the end, and they have the sort of studio spotlight showcase section where they go through all the main studios like Disney, DreamWorks, Paramount. And in the Paramount section on a bunch of these websites was the fact that apparently Paramount were going to be doing kind of presentations at the film festival, giving basically first looks, previews effectively of, the Aang movie. But also the SpongeBob SquarePants movie that's coming out like just the month before, basically. So it wasn't just Avatar here, and that was quite exciting because, they're just doing the next event up. That makes sense. Finally, it seems pretty exciting. I do think some of it was reported with the sense that like publicly we're going to get to see a first look when the festival would still be much the same as CinemaCon, where it's behind closed doors. But it was hopeful that it was actually going to appear. What seems to have changed in the last like 24 hours is that basically all of these articles that mentioned Paramount and that the Aang movie was going to be presented at this event have removed all traces, not just of the Avatar stuff, but of Paramount having a showing here in the first place. I don't believe any of these places have mentioned why they took this out. It just has been flat out removed, edited out of articles, with no mention of Paramount whatsoever. So people are extremely confused as to what's actually happening here, in the sense of, well, I struggle to believe that the likes of like the Hollywood Reporter has just made up something about like Paramount's showcase here. So I'm assuming they maybe missed an embargo or something like that and just posted all the information about the Annecy Film Festival before they were maybe meant to. Because especially when it comes to the studios, it seems like some of them had done specific announcements in terms of like, oh, Netflix made a big deal about what they're going to be showing off at the event, but Paramount didn't make their own public announcement about their stuff. It was just included kind of press release style in the document. So has it just been removed because they haven't made their official announcement? Because it's still quite early. Like, we're still in April. The event is in kind of early to mid June. And I think the Avatar kind of presentation was meant to be on the 12th, which again, where did this information come from? It makes you question a lot of things, and that I assume behind the scenes they got a press release, but it's kind of unclear from the way some of these places presented their article. What do you make of this? I think we all expected something at Annecy, but for it to be kind of revealed and then taken away, what are your thoughts on what's happened here?
Yeah, I don't know. This definitely feels weird in the way that they're sort of presenting it. I mean, this feels sort of like how, Paramount has been recently sort of divulging things or not really divulging sort of the information about sort of their movies and their projects coming up. So I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me if this was supposed to be like something that wasn't officially sort of announced, but will still happen at the sort of event here. Because it is, it is a private-ish event, it's accredited. You have to be accredited to actually go to it and stuff like that. So it's not like it's, a random sort of, SDCC or anything like that where anyone can just go to it, assuming you can get tickets and stuff like that. So I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if it still happens, but I don't know. I mean, we know that, currently the production is where it's at, or as far as we understand it to be. So it'd be cool if they were actually able to sort of show some things there and actually get sort of like a decent look at things. I mean, I'm sure it won't be like anything done or anything like that, but I don't know. It's interesting the way that these things seem to go back and forth.
Yeah, it's just, I think it's created a bit of a situation now where I think the whole fandom just feels like, what are you waiting for? Why does this still not feel real yet? Like, we're getting this some information, but it's so small. The fact that, like, coming out of CinemaCon, it wasn't posted about on any of the official social media channels that we have an official title for this. Just nothing mentioned, so it doesn't really feel like it's proper information. And we're all just kind of waiting for, like, yeah, when will we be able to just go to the Avatar Studios website and it just has the basic information about this movie up there, nothing crazy, just the basics. And it just feels like I don't know when it's actually going to happen. Like, they are being oddly secretive about this for some reason, but it's not really clear if there's a big plan in place. Like, you'd almost maybe assume, like, well, are they actually going to go all out at San Diego Comic-Con? That would almost make sense at this point, because they've been holding off, and now they are maybe suppressing information about any showing at the Annecy Film Festival. Do they just want to have a big showcase? Because I think we're all almost expecting that at this point, that it'll be almost be a little bit disappointing if we just get the bare minimum information versus, like, SDCC Avatar panel. Here's the slate of projects announcements, kind of like Marvel Star Wars style, that we maybe want, but we have no clue if that's actually going to happen or not. And the longer it goes with no communication, the more kind of people get really nervous about what's happening, because as far as we're aware, it's still a January release, and it's getting to be very late in the game. Paramount already do basic information pretty late, but this is becoming, I think, a little bit of an issue here. So if they don't do anything at Annecy and we still don't hear anything at that point, it's going to feel like we're almost absolutely expecting a delay of some sort, which doesn't necessarily match up with the production information, but we just have no clue what's actually going on here. So I don't know, after all this, where do you think we're actually going to get our first proper information from?
It's a good one. I mean, and I'm thinking, everyone normally just assumes San Diego Comic-Con, and that usually is where, we get film and production sort of events versus, New York Comic-Con, where it's just usually more paper media, sort of that type of focus sort of thing. So I don't know. I mean, I would really hope that they do have something to show. I wonder if, we're assuming that the production of the animation was finished, a week before CinemaCon, would they have something worthy of actually showing that, eventually would get out to the public as well by San Diego Comic-Con? I mean, I definitely could see something, but I don't know if that would be enough time for them to really have something that they feel is worth showing. I do hope that they can at least sort of like, I don't know, do some sort of listing, even if it is sort of like a joint event at like another, Paramount sort of panel, not like a solely Avatar focused one, because I don't know. I feel like until things really start going with sort of like shows and stuff and they're actually out there for people to view it, I don't think they're going to see sort of the huge value in sort of having, like you're saying, like a Marvel style panel where, they think they can have it garner enough interest to sort of fill a area capacity, with the sort of featured lineup of stuff. So I think maybe they think, they need to have something more to actually show before they go that sort of route.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I feel like, I definitely could see people arguing against that, considering how, how big we think it is and stuff like that. But I don't know. For them, that might be the thing. I mean, even if, like, I think it could fill like one of the smaller type of rooms, which are still rather large at the conventions and stuff like that, if anyone's ever been to them. So I don't know. I feel like it could definitely fill one of those, maybe not the main stage, but, sort of the side stages that are usually pretty big. But it definitely doesn't feel like they have enough confidence in it for that. So I don't know. I still would go with San Diego Comic-Con for something, I don't know, maybe like we'll go hopeful and say they have like a teaser trailer ready, not like a full trailer, but maybe a teaser trailer ready by San Diego Comic-Con. Then, maybe if it's not already out by New York Comic-Con, they could have a full trailer. Maybe. I don't know. That would be like my hopeful thinking for the production schedule, assuming there's no delays or anything like that, or any other issues that could impede the production of the movie.
Yeah, that's the thing, is like at this point it kind of feels like, are they waiting to more or less have the first big marketing thing almost be the first trailer, and they want to just have it like showcased really clearly? Like they don't want to have just one image out there for a really long time, just the logo, and do it in that kind of way. They just want to be like, hey, here it is, and here's all the information all at once, and go from there. Maybe, like you said, like teaser trailer rather than like full trailer. Obviously they can do that later. That's probably the case. But then I also kind of feel like for Comic-Con, I'm almost more confident they'll say more about the show Seven Havens than they will about the movie.
Yeah.
Just because it feels like they're going to be way more open about like concept art for the show than the movie. Because do they ever really show concept art for movies ahead of time? I think in most cases I don't really think they do. They always kind of hold that back until afterwards. But with the shows, they hopefully will be a bit more open. And yeah, we just have to wait and see. But it means like by the time we get to Annecy, we'll be in the build up to learning about what's happening at San Diego Comic-Con, and we'll hopefully know like what panels they are and are not doing. In the meantime, we're also kind of expecting the Brave and the Elements podcast to launch again for season 4, where there's already been like a little bit of a teaser that like the usual premiere interview with Mike and Brian is going to be a thing. And will they say anything in the interview, or will it be another like tortured question session at the start with them? We have to wait and see. But that's that. Final piece of news, nearly forgot about it, is that actually just yesterday we got preview pages for the upcoming Free Comic Book Day 2025 Avatar story. So the Dark Horse book this year is Star Wars and Avatar. Avatar is the kind of secondary comic. Star Wars has the cover. We've known for a while that it is a Samurai Appa Ronin Momo story, but a lot of the information we just haven't really had. We've had a basic description, but now we have the creative team and 5 of, I'm guessing, the 10 pages of the actual book. Free Comic Book Day is in a week. It's May 3rd. It's next Saturday, so you will be able to get it for free if your comics book store that's local participates. The creative team here is Brandon Huang as writer. Art is by Belle Bessa, colors by C.E. Chant, and letters by Jimmy Benton. We're not going to go into great detail on these pages just because I actually think there's not a lot of detail to go into, because as expected, it is just a kind of daydream style story that they're playing relatively serious, which is a bit odd to me. I really like the art, but I don't really have much confidence in the story. Like, it looks like it's going to build up to, a fight's about to happen. I'm guessing the next 5 pages are a pretty fun action scene because of, Appa with the multiple swords and what he's going to do, that sort of thing. Well, they'll end by finally getting the food they're after. I wonder, will they kind of make it a little bit funny by having, Aang wake up at the end and just asking himself, hey, why do I keep dreaming about these two on adventures? Because if they don't, I think that's almost a really weird thing to do. It's just a complete daydream AU story without properly leaning into it that way. I definitely have questions about why they went with this completely, in that I get it, this is a memorable kind of meme moment from Avatar, but does it need to have its own comic? I'm not really sure, compared to what some of the previous Free Comic Book Day books have done in the past. This feels a little on the lighter side, and I'm not I don't have too much hope for the pages we haven't seen yet, which is unfortunate. So I'm not super excited for this, but I will say the art is very, very good. What are your thoughts on the preview that we have here for Ramen Rumble?
Yeah, the preview itself, I think, is fine. It gives you a good idea of what they're going for, and these two characters in this sort of dreamlike state that it is popular. It is a fun sort of moment. I think it does bring up a lot of memories for people who have seen the show in its entirety, so it stands out in that regard. So it's definitely a cool bit to sort of hit on, just to sort of have. I think I can understand the idea where we're sort of lacking for Avatar content. It seems sort of odd to go with sort of a story that really has no bearing on the larger picture of things. It's just sort of a fun random thing to have, which is cool. It's cool, but it doesn't sort of directly feed into anything, which some of the other stories we've had, not all of them have directly fed into things, or didn't have much sort of I guess you could say bearing on sort of the larger scheme of things in the world, like sort of Korra times, or even some of the Avatar ones. But at least it was with sort of our main characters, and it sort of fleshed them out a bit. This, as fun as it is for Momo and Appa, it doesn't really, I don't know how this would transfer to their real life personality, them being pets and stuff like that. So I don't know. It definitely, seems like an odd one. It definitely feels like it's more of just a choice of one to make, so that it doesn't sort of, mess with anything that they're doing, which unfortunately has been the plan of what they've been doing for the last, year or two or whatever. So it falls in line with that, which means it probably was, directly from up on high told to do this sort of thing, so that it doesn't sort of skew anything going forward. So I don't know. It definitely just feels like it's just one in the middle, just so that they have a comic out there. But I don't know. Maybe this would have been better just not having an Avatar comic, which, I feel it's bad to sort of say that, but maybe there's something else that they could have done in this sort of place, in this production, that would have more benefited the overall sort of Avatar things going forward.
Yeah, because the whole point of Free Comic Book Day is that it's the publisher giving you these previews or teasers of their main series, and you get this, and then you look around and you see the full titles from this series and you go and buy it. This is a very odd choice to do as a preview, because it's effectively a non-canon story. Again, unless they kind of have a scene of Aang waking up at the end, and then they make it that canonically, Aang does regularly dream about these guys. If not, then it's just kind of this weird AU thing, and then that's meant to get people to grab the promise out of nowhere, or go over to the Korra side of things, pick up the most recent comic. That's a bit weird. Dark Horse are also the one kind of publisher that haven't really given their kind of like what they're going to be doing into the future, because we're waiting for the next Avatar comic, the next Korra comic to be announced from the anniversary press release, whatever this comic miniseries is. So they've got 3 potentially more big announcements that they still have to do. The only announcement they've made recently has been Beast of the Four Nations, which, you know, realistically should have probably been out years ago. But in terms of actual comics, they need to kind of get going, and it feels like this is just an odd choice to have as potentially the last book of the year, because it's not guaranteed we're for sure guaranteed like another book this year. We don't know what way the scheduling and announcements are going to fall. We'll have to, I guess, maybe wait for Comic-Con to see if they have a lot more to on that side of things. So yeah, bit of an odd one here again, because there's also the situation of now this I think would be the 3rd Avatar comic that hasn't been collected anywhere, where it's only available through Free Comic Book Day. So we're getting to the point where like short story collection to collect all these, there's like this Lost and Found from I think 2 years ago, and Matcha Makers from a year or 2 before that. So that's definitely getting into the territory of like, yeah, you need somewhere to put all these books, but do they have that in the planning? I'm not really sure overall. And this is where, yeah, Comic-Con's going to be big, regardless of if they do other stuff, because publishing is meant to be expanding, and it is, and we've already seen some of it elsewhere, but not quite from Dark Horse yet, who are the main publishers, so they have to kind of put on a good show, it feels like, because like you say, this book definitely feels like it very much represents where the comics are right now, where they're not trying to do anything big or impactful. This just happens to lean very far on the end of being inconsequential, but we'll move on. So we move away from news. Again, we hope stuff happens soon, to our reviews. So we're going to be doing the Avatar episodes first. So we're going to start off here with 215, The Tales of Ba Sing Se. But before I suppose we jump into this specifically, we maybe just have to have a talk about the fact that, hey, we're at this really important point in the series. We've just done City of Walls and Secrets. We talked last time out about how this is a really important part of the series. It's regarded as one of the most well-written kind of sections of the show. This plus like Lake Laogai is a really strong arc. But we kind of have to discuss here that we're discussing these 2 episodes that happen in the middle of this arc that are very different, kind of more experimental, and it's a bit of a risk almost in the middle of your really well-written arc to have like a selection of short stories followed by an episode that focuses on our animal companion character right in the middle of, you know, when things are really heating up. What are your thoughts on this when you kind of look back on the structure of book 2, that they go from the crazy conspiracy of City of Walls and Secrets into 2 very different episodes?
Yeah, no, that's a good point to make there, because it definitely feels like a bit of divergence, but I don't feel like many people, you know, ever mention it in that sort of way, that this is sort of like pretty clear cut, you know, different direction for, you know, 2 episodes in, you know, whatever, you know, most people consider one of the strongest, if not the strongest, you know, seasons of Avatar here. And I think because of the strength of most of these stories, I think most people don't really see it in that sort of light, you know, sort of the sort of default sort of like filler episodes that you would have in a show, in a series, where there's just sort of, you know, they need, you know, time for things to catch up if this was, you know, comparing with some other media that was running production alongside it. But this is its own sort of story. There isn't anything else to sort of like compare it with. So this was, you know, a deliberate choice on the creators and the writing team and everything to sort of insert these, you know, bits of stories here to sort of flesh out our characters, and just sort of show them in sort of this new city, this new environment that, you know, a lot of them don't really have a lot of experience sort of interacting with, because, you know, they're from more sort of like rural areas and not with many people. You know, this is more sort of high society, and some of them have even sort of rejected this sort of, you know, sort of living and stuff like that. So I think it definitely, you know, is a departure of the way that they've sort of been charting the course. But I think, you know, for me personally, I think most of these stories, they definitely do add something. Like they're short, they're sort of directly to the point. Some of them barely have any sort of dialogue in them, but they tell a complete story, and they have something that you can sort of look back onto it and see where it fits in the bigger picture. I think that really helps, at least for this first one, not to feel like it's sort of so out of place, because it definitely has reasons for why they're sort of showing these things. And I think it's, our characters have been traveling, through this journey and everything like this, but there's other things that have happened from different viewpoints that we don't necessarily get to see. And I think these two episodes specifically sort of do a good job of covering that.
Mm. Yeah, I've always felt like it works just because the last episode kind of sets up a little bit of a kind of break point directly, because they're with the kind of blackmail from Long Feng. Team Avatar can't really be super active, so they just have to kind of wait and see what happens going forward. So we get to just, hey, we're in the city, we have to check things out for a while. Yeah, we get these episodes, we get to see what the life is like in the city for the different characters doing different things. And it's the same on the Zuko side of the story as well. Once they got, Jet was kind of taken away, they're successfully undercover, no one really knows they're there. So it can just be like, hey, they're living in the city just like Team Avatar are. And then obviously we'll get to it later, but with like Appa's Lost Days, I think that works as well, because it helps to make the return of Appa all the more impactful, because we already like him, but they focused on him as a character and what he was up to. They actually went back and gave him an entire episode, directly kind of interlinking with all the continuity points that like the gang went through. It's really kind of clever the way they do it, and it still makes like 214 and 217 connect quite strongly, because you have this kind of interesting kind of middle ground overall. Sure, I think it's an interesting kind of theoretical point about like what would this arc have been if it was just straight up 4 episodes of like pure conspiracy the whole way through. That might be interesting, but yeah, like you said, like I've never really seen too many people kind of complain that there is a kind of format shift in the episodes a little bit like this, because they are so unique and they stand out because of that. So we'll jump into Tales of Ba Sing Se. So of course this is the most kind of unique episode of Avatar to a certain degree, because it is these 6 short stories kind of grouped together. It is 6 tales all set in Ba Sing Se, covering a variety of different characters here. And yeah, some of them are a little bit more kind of plot focused. Some of them are more personal stories, getting to see specific interactions or specific dynamics. There is little bits of the kind of deeper plot kind of interlinked in, especially with the last one. But for the most part, it is just, here's what's happening while the plot is kind of on hold for a little. So overall, what are your thoughts on the Tales of Ba Sing Se?
Yeah, I think, for the most part, I really like these stories. I think there's fun bits in all of them for our characters, and to see how they interact in the city that I think is, new and captivating and, really huge. And it's funny how they can do things and not sort of, interact with each other at all, because the city is just that sort of huge, and they have their own interests and things that they want to do, and just sort of stumble upon things. I think it really does a good job of showing that Ba Sing Se is really huge. Like, this is a huge city. It's its own sort of culture, many different cultures within this city. So I think in terms of like giving us a sense of like scale of this, new part of the world that they're in, I think it does a great job of that, as well as just telling stories that, are meaningful to our characters in some sort of way. Some of them have, a bigger sort of, leaning on the overall thing, which I think are the ones that sort of stand out a bit more. But no, I think they're all, good for what they're sort of going for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I definitely like this episode. I wouldn't say it's like super high up on my list overall, but it's not an episode I have like really that many issues with. It's just one of those things where like I wouldn't necessarily agree with the idea that like it's one of the absolute best episodes in the entire series. It has some extremely memorable scenes, which we will get to, but I do think it's maybe just slightly held back by the fact that some of the stories are just not that kind of impactful, but we'll get into it. So we start off with the tale of Toph and Katara. So just to quickly recap this overall kind of what happens here. So we obviously open up highlighting that the group is actually pretty good at like getting up in the morning, getting themselves ready, except Toph, and we kind of emphasize her kind of slob-like tendencies here. Katara is like, okay, we gotta fix this. We're going on a girls' day out to the spa, and this seems like exactly the opposite of what Toph would want. But after some initial issues, she actually ends up enjoying herself, leading to them both happily walking out wearing makeup. Toph is then insulted by some Bossing Say mean girls. She earthbends them into the water, but you can see that she is hurt by what was said to her. And then it leads to Toph and Katara having this very nice moment where we emphasize the idea that Toph doesn't, because she's blind, she doesn't care about like her appearance or like how she's perceived. That, you know, she knows who she is and she's confident in that. Katara agrees with this, but does actually at the end tell her that she is actually pretty, and we get the reverse joke of like, I return the compliment, but I don't know what you look like, with fun. So I've always liked this one because I think it's a very different, like, you don't get to maybe see this specific dynamic among Toph and Katara that much. You see it a little bit in like season 3 and like the Runaway. But it stands out that like, oh yeah, that you get to see this kind of slightly different side of Toph, that she's not just like anti kind of like the girls' day out thing, but it's not her focus. And yeah, especially the emotional stuff towards the end, highlighting that, you know, Katara really is the kind of emotional heart of the group. She gets she gets Toph really well. It's a really nice little moment between the two to highlight an episode where these two are kind of in focus without it being about them arguing with each other, which is what they tend to focus on in some of their other episodes. So I really like this one. But what are your thoughts on the tale of Toph and Katara?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. Yeah, this is definitely a chance where they can have sort of like a real sort of heart to heart with each other that, you know, doesn't have any sort of, you know, bigger issues lingering on top of it. It's just them sort of, you know, expressing themselves, enjoying themselves out there. And it really, you know, like you said, it definitely, you know, shows a different side of Toph that we typically sort of don't see, because that's just, you know, it's not her focus. She's, you know, more action, more go for it, more, you know, doing things. You know, she doesn't necessarily contemplate, you know, things on sort of a deeper level most of the time. So yeah, it's definitely a great time to sort of get to see something that we don't typically see of her sort of character. And Katara here, I think, you know, this feels like something that she would do. Like, she would support her friends in any sort of way that she, you know, she can. And this is definitely one of those instances that works well.
Mm-hmm. So next we go to the tale of Iroh. So, quickly summed up, this is basically Iroh going around the city, gathering some supplies. He's obviously preparing for something himself, but he helps pretty much everyone he meets along the way. And we get a lot of different situations of like him cheering up a crying boy, and these other kids get themselves into a bit of a mess. He kind of gives them the advice to kind of run away. He even nearly gets mugged by someone and gives that person advice on what to do next in life. But then we get to the idea that sort of like he needs someone to kind of help him to a certain degree, because what he's been preparing for is the kind of going to kind of honor the death of his son Liu Ten, and he sings the song, of course, that he sung earlier on in the episode, Leaves from the Vine, Little Soldier Boy. And also we get the reveal here that this is not just kind of in-universe Iroh remembering Liu Ten, but it's also out-of-universe, the memorial effectively honoring Mako, Iroh's voice actor, who had passed away in or around this time when this episode aired. So it's a kind of doubly emotional episode here, where we get some more Liu Ten kind of focus for Iroh, but it's also the real-life kind of incident as well. So, this is definitely the part of the episode that I think is most remembered. This is I would say the Iroh crying scene is probably one of the most talked about Avatar scenes, full stop. So it's a very, very notable section. What are your thoughts on the tale of Iroh?
Yeah, this is definitely the most, you know, I definitely would say it's probably the most emotional one out of the ones in this episode here. So it definitely, you know, stands out over the course of time. I think, you know, if there's one that people remember from this episode, this would be the one, and maybe the Zuko one as well. So yeah, I think it's definitely, you know, something to see Iroh in this sort of situation because he does pretty well in most sort of things. So to see him have this sort of, emotional breakdown, definitely stands out because usually he's always sort of so supportive of everyone else. And, you can see that in this episode or in this, sort of short story here, how he has the ability to sort of help everyone in their sort of situations. But yeah, it shows that, almost everyone sort of needs some help at some point in time here. So no, I think this is a good one. And just the fact that he's in the city where, this whole issue with his son happened before, just makes it doubly so. I mean, it makes you wonder what he would have done, what he did, all the other years for the passing of his son. But this time he can actually be in sort of like the direct place where it happens. So it might be even sort of harder for him in this sort of situation here.
Mm. Yeah, you have the kind of theme throughout this one of him helping other people, and then he kind of wishes that he could have done something kind of during the incident to help his own son. I think the one interesting thing about this is also just that it's only like very, very recently we've actually learned any information of any note about Liu Ten as a character, which is, at least for me,
Sure.
always been the one thing that has maybe just slightly made me hold back on going crazy in on how amazing this scene is just that, this is a character we don't really know except that he died. And to a certain degree, there's still some parts of the whole story about what exactly happened that we don't really know. But it does seem like Liu Ten did just kind of die towards the end of a battle, like kind of almost randomly. It wasn't some huge giant event. And the whole point is that, like, yeah, Iroh wasn't directly there on the scene to do anything because it did just happen. And that's the kind of tragedy of war that completely changed him as a character kind of coming after this. But still, like, it's a hugely kind of powerful scene because even though they haven't maybe characterized Liu Ten in the show, they've brought it up enough times in like the context of just Iroh's dynamic with Zuko that that this is a big, big, big moment for him. So yeah, really standout kind of one here, which brings us into the tale of Aang, which is Aang helping a Ba Sing Se zookeeper out. The animals are not very happy because they don't have a lot of space. They're in cages, and they kind of say that the Dai Li isn't allowing him to kind of expand or do anything. So the zoo is failing. Aang wants to help the animals out, so they basically release all the animals. Aang guides them outside the walls, creates a new enclosure for them, basically out of earth, so they have a giant space to be in. And we just get this kind of rampage of the animals through the city as Aang guides them out. And we just end with this note of like, hey, Aang has helped people as the Avatar here, doing a kind of smaller scale thing, and highlighting that, of course, he's always been super into animals and that whole sort of thing. And they don't directly bring it up, but there's just that idea of with Appa missing, here he is interacting with the other animals. That's nice to see. Maybe one of the other notable bits is that it is one of the few times we see an Avatar bend two elements at the same time, not in the Avatar state when he's on the air scooter and earthbending. We don't get to see that often at all, really. So that's a somewhat interesting point, plus another Cabbage Merchant appearance, which is always worth noting. Overall, probably one of the maybe less important ones overall, given that like it's our main character. But the animal connection with Appa missing, I think, is something that makes it feel partially relevant, even if it's not the most standout part of the episode. But thoughts on the Tale of Aang?
Yeah, it definitely, in terms of like story beats and stuff like that, it definitely doesn't sort of stand out. I don't know, for some reason I always just remember it just because it's really cool how he sort of builds the enclosure, with his bending and on the air scooter. So I always remember it for that part, not necessarily like, anything else in terms of the bigger things. I mean, it's nice that he, finds another use for, the whistle. That's interesting just to see how that works, especially considering how the whistle comes into play in the next episode as well. So it's definitely something of a note, which I'm sure they did that totally on purpose in terms of the animals and the whistle and stuff like that. So no, I think it's a fun one just to see Aang interacting with animals. He's always good with animals. For the most part, maybe he was a little bit overconfident in the beginning, but everything works out in the end.
Yeah, and I suppose with Beast of the Four Nations coming out, like this is actually one of the episodes where we see like the most amount of different animals, and we're like introduced to some of them for the first time. Like I think this is the first time we see a Rabaroo and things like that, which is sort of notable. And then maybe a little bit of a Netflix reference here, but like this is one of those ones where we're talking about this as like this is a super not important part of the episode, but like this would be a crazy thing to try and do in live action for such a kind of not important scene. Like they wouldn't attempt to do this one like at all with that many animals. So that's kind of a kind of funny little thing there. Next up is the Tale of Sokka, which is effectively just a full kind of comedy thing, start to finish. He walks into he kind of falls into the 575 Society, and they're basically doing haikus. He gets into a haiku battle with the kind of leader here, Makmu Ling, and they just go back and forth until eventually he gets overconfident and says a syllable too much, and he gets thrown out. This one mainly, I think, stands out just because it's obviously a very impressively written episode, because it's all haikus basically. Like there's very few pieces of dialogue in this one that isn't a haiku. So it's fun in that sense, but it is just literally Sokka falls into a place he walks by basically. But you know, it's fun. I think that's the thing. It stands out as being kind of creative and unique and perfectly Sokka as well. But what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, I would agree. This is definitely a perfectly sort of Sokka moment here of him, using his intellect to some degree here. This, definitely shows his sort of character traits and his ability to sort of think on the fly, for the most part, until he sort of gets a little bit too wrapped up in things, which is also very sort of on brand for a Sokka sort of character here. So yeah, no, him sort of trying to show off and trying to sort of make himself seem cool and eventually sort of, feeling it at the end, I think is definitely sort of something that feels like him. Not a big bearing on sort of the overall story or anything like that, but, it would be a fun story to tell someone, and Sokka would probably sort of embellish it and make it sound, more important than it really was.
Mm-hmm. Next up is the Tale of Zuko. So this is the kind of legendary date with Jin episode, which is, I suppose, particularly of note because somehow we are getting a novel all about Jin coming up in just a few weeks, actually. So this is her main appearance, but not her only appearance, because she does technically have kind of single scene, like a person in the background moments in a couple of other episodes, and then there's a comic, Going Home Again, that also features her. So it's not her only appearance, but it's her only like main appearance, basically. So interesting just to kind of look back on this one ahead of, like, we're going to get a 300-page book about this character shortly, and it kind of speaks to how we don't know a lot about her, even given that she's one of the main characters in this, but we'll go through it here. So, yeah, Zuko and Iroh at the tea shop. Jin comes in. Zuko thinks she's spying on him because she keeps coming in. Iroh alerts him to the fact that she has a crush on him. She asks him out. Iroh agrees on Zuko's behalf, so Zuko goes on this awkward date, and it is quite awkward. Zuko has no idea really what he's doing. She seems quite kind of confident and forward, and is honestly interested, and he sort of bumbles his way through it. Eventually we get to like Jin's favorite area of the city, but it's not lit up, and he does do the nice kind of thing for her where he has her close her eyes and he lights it all up with firebending without kind of exposing himself, leading to her being shocked. She kisses him. He runs off saying, like, it's complicated. And we end on the note of, like, Iroh asking him, like, how was it? He shuts the door, but then comes back and says, it was nice. So it's this idea of Zuko with that kind of conflict he's had this whole time through the season of, he could just fully, I suppose, step away from his destiny and have a peaceful life somewhere that, like, hey, this relationship, if you pursued it, could go somewhere, and like you could like live in the city for the rest of your life if you really, really wanted to. But there's something that keeps him attached onto his destiny, kind of something more. Is this actually what he wants at this point in time? There's also maybe a slight sense of the whole May is about to be properly kind of introduced with the relationship dynamic there, but it's interesting. Like, there's a little bit of nuance to this when you think about it a little bit more, but ultimately it's just awkward Zuko on a date with this really kind of nice bubbly girl, and kind of what could have been type situation. So what are your thoughts on the tale of Zuko?
Yeah, no, I think it definitely. I don't know. I feel like people always sort of mention this in terms of, Zuko and his relationships or, lack of relationships. But I think it's nice to see sort of him, maybe not sort of in sort of the perfect element that he's sort of, you're used to seeing him in here. He is, sort of awkward sort of character self here, which, he has those moments here and there. But even here, definitely, it's a good sort of change of pace. He doesn't even sort of realize it at first until, sort of, wingman sort of Iroh here sort of helps him along with things. So no, I think it's a fun one. It definitely sort of, makes waves in terms of, it just being dealing with sort of a character that, is very favorite of everyone. And yeah, it's interesting that we are sort of getting more information on Jin and sort of her sort of background in the city, which, I mean, I'm sure there are tons of stories in Bossing Say that could be sort of told and stuff like that. So it's just notable that, she's getting a little bit more of it. And I don't know, I wonder how that's going to sort of play out into the larger scheme of things, or if there's going to be any sort of, future occurrences of her character and stuff like that going forward.
Yeah, because the book, given that we don't know too much about it yet, we don't have preview pages yet, but based on the description, it looks like it's going to take place probably like before, during, and after this kind of main appearance, give or take. And then because the book already mentions that like it's going to be in like almost all parts of the city, lower, middle, and kind of upper ring, it kind of feels like, yeah, we could be referencing a lot of different things here in terms of like, okay, like Jin heading up into the upper ring, what does she encounter that we've kind of seen before? But there is also just the sense that like, oh wow, like this is this character who we don't actually get too many character traits with her. So it's going to be interesting to see her maybe put into a situation where she kind of has a mission to go on herself, when like very little about her character maybe comes across that way, but except for the fact that she just seems like she gets on really well with people and is just going to kind of, I suppose, maybe be able to talk her way in and out of places if she has to, because she seems quite confident and forward and that sort of thing. But what would be your take on her, like, but based on the way her character is presented here, and sort of that she's going to be placed in more of a kind of, I suppose, dramatic situations in the book? How do you think it's going to play out?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I don't know. That's because, I mean, she seems like a positive character. She has sort of a decent and level sort of head. I don't know, would she be sort of like really apt in those sort of situations? Does she have any sort of like, I don't know, additional skills or talent or, sort of abilities or something like that that we wouldn't necessarily be aware of because, we didn't really spend that much time with her. So I don't know. That's something to see where they're going to sort of take her character in the larger scheme of things. I think it's cool that, she is relatively blank in terms of, the larger scheme of things and how she can play overall into sort of like the story or behind the story of, our main sort of characters here. So yeah, no, I'm not sure where they're going to take her.
Yeah, because they're almost implying that the whole idea of the Avatar Legends book series is that like the characters somehow gets themselves involved behind the scenes in a plot point that the main characters got involved in, and that she potentially in some way like inadvertently facilitated something happening that we were not aware of before.
Yeah.
So it feels like there's going to be some kind of big crossover to a certain degree, that like, she interacted with Long Feng at this point and then the scene happens next, or something like that. So will be fun to see what happens there. The book it's not too far away, but we're still waiting for more information. And that leads us into the last story, and that is the tale of Momo. So this one is obviously completely from Momo's point of view, which is an interesting setup for the next episode. But yeah, we see straight away Momo misses Appa greatly. He kind of goes out by himself just to kind of drink and get some food. And ends up interacting with some other animals. They kind of chase him around a bit, and there's the whole hijinks happening with Momo just getting himself into situations. eventually he kind of frees the animals who were chasing him. They lead him to Appa's footprint and a clump of fur, and it's the setup directly for the next episode that Appa was actually at some point in Ba Sing Se. We obviously question a little bit about how exactly he got here, but it's just again bringing us back to the idea Appa is missing, and of course even Momo misses him quite a lot. So fun little one, and again it's just in crazy interactions just in a small section of the city with Momo and some other animals. It's pretty nice. There's maybe not too much to say, but again, no dialogue really in this one, and I suppose you see how he interprets human speaking from one of his point of view scenes as well. But thoughts on this final tale?
Yeah, I think, for a story that doesn't have any sort of, dialogue or, much human dialogue that's understandable, I think it does a pretty good job of, having sort of coherent story that you can sort of follow from beginning to end, and just sort of understanding sort of, a little bit of Momo's sort of viewpoint here, and sort of how he, feels things are being different now. And I think it's definitely a good sort of lead into the next one. But even just sort of on its own, I think it's, interesting where we get the perspective of a completely different creature than we're sort of used to seeing here, and how they're interacting with the world here, and how, he can actually sort of befriend people by sort of helping them out. So it's, very sort of on brand for like sort of a animal companion of sort of Aang. So I like that sort of, similarity that they have here. So it definitely, shows that, stories with these sort of, companion sort of characters here, they can work well, in certain cases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, watching that tale and then 216 definitely makes me go like, I think I probably would have preferred the Free Comic Book Day book just be like a fun, uniquely kind of drawn, written story with actual Appa and Momo like getting up to something, rather than needing to go for the samurai versions where they can talk. But we'll see what that book is like when it actually comes out. But yeah, we'll move into 216, Appa's Lost Days. So yeah, again, another unique episode here because it is basically completely from Appa's point of view, going all the way back to when he was taken by the Sandbenders, catching us up to basically like where he is basically right now in Ba Sing Se when he gets captured, and covering all the different ground and characters that he meets along the way. And I think the big thing here is just that like the amount of connective tissue to so many other elements of the series that's here is kind of crazy. Like there's so many specific references, of course, to the desert, that he is almost like just behind the gang or just after the gang and kind of coming to specific spots in the desert. Then it's like, oh, this is the Ty Lee circus that he's now at. And, he goes back to the library. But then he's also the character who allows us to kind of see what Suki's up to at this point in time, where Azula's been this last while. And then most notably, it's through him that we meet Guru Patik for the first time, which very good setup for the kind of finale. So it's not just that they kind of did the animal episode, but like it's actually really cleverly written to introduce a lot of elements and characters into play, so that we know about other events that the gang didn't experience but Appa did. So that's kind of a fun thing as well. So I really enjoy this episode. It definitely makes it kind of worth having the whole episode be focused on Appa, because they do such a good job showing it as this torturous journey for him, and you feel so bad about what happened to him. But what are your thoughts on Appa's Lost Days?
Yeah, no, I think you definitely have a strong emotional connection with Appa throughout this whole sort of episode here, just through all the different sort of, things that he has to deal with on this journey. I think, his ability, of course, this has always been like his strongest thing, is just his ability to fly and get everywhere means that he can, cover so much distance, which means he can do really so much without almost sort of any barriers or borders other than, ones that are sort of forced upon him by other people here. So it really does, make it seem like he goes on sort of this huge sort of journey just by himself because he can, and that's sort of, what he's able to do here. And, things don't obviously always work out for him, and he has to deal with, people, and he now has sort of like these new sort of fears that you can see him sort of develop over time here and sort of how that plays into different things here. So he definitely sort of grows and learns as a character, as well as just, all the different sort of times where he thinks back to things that have happened in the past and all the sort of, short sort of flashbacks that also interconnect with sort of Aang. I think those moments are really good here, how they sort of branch those moments. So, even if this is just sort of a companion animal sort of episode here, the fact that it does sort of, play off everything else that all the other characters have done really makes it sort of like a stronger episode than you might have otherwise sort of thought when you just sort of read the title. It's like, oh, we're just going to follow Appa and sort of what he did while he wasn't with all the other characters. There's a lot more that goes on with him when he's just by himself here.
Yeah. The flashback point is good as well because kind of highlighting that it's not just Aang remembering meeting Appa for the first time. It's the reverse as well, that he goes back to the place where he grew up. That's what brings him to the Eastern Air Temple. He remembers Aang giving him that apple that first time, and it's just a really strong characterization of an animal, like probably one of the best we've kind of seen. I think it won an award at some point, I think, for portrayal of animals in like a kids show, I think. So it's a pretty impressive episode overall. So let's go through this. So it's obviously told in the perspective of, we go scene to scene to scene to scene. It really kind of covers the ground quite quickly. They actually give us a specific period of time. 4 weeks ago, Appa is taken by the Sandbenders, of course, at the end of the library. We see, of course, the Sandbenders take him away. They're going to sell Appa to the beetle-headed merchants, which is a sort of interesting thing in the context of Realms Collide is just released, because the one slight piece of lore that Realms Collide kind of introduces is the idea of the different tribes in the Siwang Desert, and obviously these merchants are one of them that goes unnamed, basically, but you learn about some of that stuff, like the Shattered Skulls are basically the Kiat tribe. Now, they've committed to the idea it is a non-canon story, but they use the open ground of there's multiple tribes in the Siwang Desert to kind of have their kind of unique lore, which is kind of interesting here, that there's more to be explored in the desert than just Sandbenders, and Wan Shi Tong's library was here at some point. There's some nice continuity points here where like Appa is the one to basically throw the sand sailor that they find in the desert episode. Kind of later on, we see that when Aang calls him on the Sky Bison whistle, Appa does actually hear it and nearly escapes, but is of course subdued by the Shirshu spit darts that the beetle-headed merchants have. So lots of references actually come into play here. It's quite it's an episode that's very heavy on references to other parts of the series. But what are your thoughts on this first section here, just before we get to the circuit?
Yeah, no, I think this is, I don't know, it definitely does, I guess, sort of make the desert feel more sort of alive than you initially sort of thought it was, because it really just seems like it's like, okay, it's just Sandbenders, Misty Palm Oasis and the library here, but, there is a bit more to it, and, Appa, unfortunately gets to sort of deal with another sort of the groups of people in the desert here. So, no, it's definitely, I don't know, it's interesting to see this and where Appa was at any moment in time, because it really does feel like he was so close to getting the Aang, which just makes that earlier episode feel sort of even worse when you sort of go back and sort of think about it, because he really was sort of, so sort of close to just sort of finding Appa in that moment in time. To like the fact that he can sort of see the sort of dust cloud when Aang gets sort of upset, makes it all the more heartbreaking that he was really, relatively close to him, that, if he had sort of just a little bit more sort of air power, he probably could have seen him.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, we find out that the beetle-headed merchants were planning to sell him kind of to Ba Sing Se, but they want to get rid of him sooner, so they sell him to the Fire Nation circus. So we see he's now in the circus. He's going to be trained by the firebender trainer they have there. Of course, he just wants the food, so he gets the food with his airbending instead of being given it by the trainer. Yeah, and this kind of begins to build up Like Appa already didn't like fire, but this kind of doubles down on his fear of fire. He's very, very terrified of fire because of stuff that happens in this episode. So yeah, the reference here is, of course, this is the circus that Ty Lee was at kind of originally, and kind of show you a slightly different side of it, because Ty Lee looks back on this as a pretty positive thing overall, but actually you see that some of the treatment of the animals behind the scenes is not great, of course. We see that there's this kind of boy who kind of looks out for him at the circus, and Appa kind of is reminded of Aang when he sees this boy. He eventually escapes during his performance, after he just gets so scared of the fire and what's happening here. But he has like shackles on in the kind of aftermath of this, so it begins to build this idea of like the poor treatment from kind of many people he comes across in the episode. But it's a fun reference here to just get across this idea that we could have just done this very simply. These other merchants took him to Ba Sing Se, but no, there's like a million stops on the way before we eventually get there. But what are your thoughts on the circus sequence?
Yeah, I thought it's definitely sort of like a sad one to sort of see Appa in this sort of situation here where he's, put in a cage, and that's just sort of the worst thing ever, of course. And just to see him try to sort of interact in this environment and sort of have the sort of outfit, it definitely, I don't know, it really feels like it's a real sort of relative in reference to how, sort of some things are for some animals here. So it's interesting to see sort of Appa in this sort of situation, especially with his sort of like level of intelligence that he sort of has here, and how he's really, not really about anything this sort of trainer dude is sort of trying to do here. So no, it's definitely really sad one to see him sort of, act in fear of the fire and everything.
Mm-hmm. We also get more references at this point to the whole wind buffalo thing, because I guess people are so unfamiliar with sky bison that I guess it's just history has sort of forgotten them in some places, and people are confused about, because they're both referring to the same thing, but like it's just this made up other name, wind buffalo, sky bison, and it's a fun little thing. And also just the fact that the circus feels the need to dress up Appa even more to make him stand out it kind of speaks to the whole thing that like he doesn't stand out enough on his own just as an animal, when most other people who see him just on his own react in a crazy way already. So it's just a funny thing of the circus feels like they need to go completely over the top. But yeah, after this we see he flies back to the library, and we get the idea that, of course, Wan Shi Tong took the library back, so there's nothing left. This is where we see him go through a lot of the same places in the desert that the gang was at. He's looking for food, so he goes to the buzzard wasps, and he gets some stuff out of that, but, he continues to get kind of a little bit more injured as kind of time goes on, encountering issues at kind of every turn here, and it's just things are going from kind of worse to worse. Eventually, he kind of sleeps in a barn that he kind of finds, and this is where he dreams of the day that he first met Aang, and he was given the apple, which is a very, very cool little sequence here, because you see kind of his, I guess, mother kind of brings him over, and you see some of the other kids with the other baby sky bison, and it's a very cute scene. And I think, is it at this point, or is it a little later on in the episode, they do actually cut away to Aang kind of remembering the same thing. At the same, and he's at this point he's at like the Serpent's Pass, give or take. It's a fun way that they do that little kind of sequence as well. And again, we see the little things like this, like where he flies over Iroh and Zuko on their way to Ba Sing Se on the ship, but Iroh doesn't tell Zuko that that's what he saw, which is again a fun little reference. But what are your thoughts on this kind of a little montage here from the library up to the Iroh spotting?
Yeah, no, it's just a part of Appa's journey here that's very sort of hard for him. Him just sort of trying to survive and sort of get by here, and interacting in environments that he's not really sort of used to. I mean, this is it's interesting to note, just because they can fly and they can go anywhere, but they're not really like any sort of creature or any animal or any person, they're not really, used to being in any sort of, different environment than they're sort of, from. So him sort of interacting in the desert and trying to eat the cactus and, sort of getting, stung by that and sort of dealing with the buzzard wasps. Yeah, it just sort of shows that just because he can go sort of anywhere doesn't mean that he belongs in all those different places here. So yeah, it's something to see, and just him sort of get more and more haggard as he goes along this journey. Even before we get to sort of the next scene where he's really at sort of his worst. Just to see him, sort of at this point with his fur and everything is it's definitely, sad to see, especially when you get the contrast from when you get the sort of flashback and he's sort of, young and with Aang and, sort of so clean and everything like that. So it's definitely something to see, sort of the contrast of things.
Hmm. Next up, he lands in this kind of forest, and when he finds a little spot to kind of rest in, a porcupine kind of comes out. So Appa fights the porcupine, and of course he gets stabbed by a bunch of the quills. He eventually kind of tosses it away, kind of highlighting how powerful of an animal that he is. But he's reaching his limit, so he rests there for a while, and this is where we are introduced to the Kyoshi warriors, who find Appa, and this includes Suki, who's of course leading the group. And the continuity here is nice because, again, she knows from the Serpent's Past that Appa is missing, so she gets the girls together knowing that this is probably their most important mission ever, to get Appa back to Aang. Really cool addition to the episode to just catch up with where Suki is, given that she didn't join up with the group in Serpent's Pass, but you get to see actually what she's kind of been up to this whole time through. So stuff like this is where the episode, I think, goes from kind of strength to strength by using Appa interacting with some of the other kind of minor characters away from the main gang. So I really like the addition here because they actually do some really cool stuff in like the next scene. But what are your thoughts here on the fight with the porcupine and then Suki being introduced to find him?
Yeah, the fight is cool. I mean, it's sad because it's sort of, Abba sort of having to deal with this sort of crazy situation where he just wants to sort of like rest and eat here. But yeah, like you said before, it definitely shows his sort of strength of a character and just an animal, that he's able to sort of just literally just flung this other sort of huge animal just sort of like away from him and sort of scare him, and sort of does sort of like I think to sort of show that he's like the strongest in the forest here, even though he's very tired and very sort of beat up here and has to sort of, huddle away in this sort of, I guess sort of temple cave area over here. But yeah, it's definitely, I don't know, it's something to see him sort of, in this sort of state here, and this sort of, I don't know, it's nice that we do get to see more characters and have them sort of interact. So it's not, sort of solely sort of Appa, because I think, if it was sort of just him for the whole episode without any sort of, human characters at all, it might seem a bit sort of much. But I think the way that they do it here definitely works.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, from here we see that she can tell how absolutely terrified Appa is. He doesn't really trust people anymore. So she quickly kind of brings him up some food and then kind of leaves and backs away. She comes back later with the rest of the girls, and eventually they're able to kind of get through to him. They kind of clean him up, give him more food, remove his shackles. So it seems like he's finally getting back into a kind of better situation. But the second this happens, this is when they are found by Azula, May, and Ty Lee. So the worst possible group that could arrive at this point in time. But it also presents this really cool situation here where, like, oh, so this is what happened with Suki. She was confronted by Azula, May, and Ty Lee, and we get this fight to defend Appa here between the Kyoshi warriors and like Ozai's angels basically here. And of course Azula's group is kind of more than a match for the Kyoshi warriors, but they put up a good fight. Suki isn't really a match for Azula, so she gets Appa to leave, and the idea is that she goes in to fight Azula again, with us not really knowing how it plays out, but we know that Azula wins. Suki ends up in prison, of course, and the direct continuity here would be that we go into basically Suki alone and then Boiling Rock with her. So nice kind of continuity stuff with Suki. Very surprising kind of part of the episode that, oh, like Azula ends up encountering Suki and Appa while he was missing. That was unexpected. But it's just another way to show how dangerous this group is, given what they are about to do in the coming episodes. But what are your thoughts on this turn of events?
Yeah, no, it definitely shows the skill and the planning and the cunning that Azula has, just in terms of her character, overall throughout the whole sort of series here. And it's I don't know, it's a nice connecting bit for having Suki in here to show, how she actually got to the situation that we see her in later on. Because otherwise, we would really, be wondering like how did Azula sort of capture her? Like it's not, maybe outside the realm of surprising possibility that that would happen, but it's nice being able to actually, show it directly and not just sort of tell it. Which is something that the show does a pretty good job overall of just, sort of showing interactions and not sort of just giving us like a lore dump or anything like that. So the fact that they're using Appa in this sort of way in order to sort of further the story that we wouldn't, normally see. Like we probably wouldn't have got this sort of any other way, other than just sort of Suki telling that, yeah, we were captured by Azula and her friends and such happened. But here we get to see it directly, and it's not even, a flashback. It's a real time sort of scene here, even if the whole episode in itself is sort of a flashback.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, Appa is kind of forced to kind of flee at this point. We get an interesting bit here where Appa is spotted by Hakoda, which is a nice little thing because he's obviously going to be kind of reintroduced shortly as well. But from there, he makes his way to the Eastern Air Temple, which is where he basically kind of grew up, which is a nice little kind of thing. He goes back to his kind of childhood, basically. And he encounters Guru Patik here for the first time. And you obviously get a bit of a sense here because this is our first time seeing the Eastern Air Temple, so it's just another abandoned air temple, of course. He goes to bite the kind of bar that they would bite when they were younger, but it's kind of covered in ash, basically. And he sees someone there, but it's not one of the air nomads, it's Guru Patik. Appa, of course, is very suspicious of someone being there. Patik is very patient. Eventually, Appa falls asleep, but then Patik demonstrates some of his unique skills where he's able to just go up, lightly touch Appa and sort of sense his energy to get a sense for like what he's been through all of this time. He then reveals that he's been waiting for Aang and Appa to arrive at some point because he had a vision in the past that he would need to be here to help the Avatar. So that's a very, very interesting detail that I don't think I had ever zoned in on as like a notable detail, but like another example of a character who has had a vision of needing to be in a specific spot in the future, because like Iroh kind of has that, a vision that he would take Ba Sing Se, and Patik also has that, and they're both, very, very spiritual characters, and Patik especially, there's a real sense that somehow there was just a sense of the future for him that he knew he needed to be here, especially because of some of the backstory with him where he is friends with Gyatso and was just in general on good terms with the air nomads, and some of the stuff that's not overly presented in his episodes that like, yeah, he's 150 years old and he has these crazy spiritual abilities despite being a non-bender. So it's a super notable character actually within the series, but what are your thoughts on this trip here to the Eastern Air Temple for Appa?
Yeah, it's definitely something to see, a new character in this sort of context, because we don't really, there's no really sort of reason or bearing, until we sort of get information from him directly why he's here, randomly when Appa's here. And, he was probably looking for Aang and Appa, right? But, the way that the universe sort of fell into place here is it's just sort of Appa here, and he has to sort of, get to him in another sort of way here. So I think it's funny how that sort of plays out here and how Appa is, just sort of, of course he's suspicious, of some random person at this place that he just happens to sort of come about here. But, he eventually sort of gets sort of worn down here. And yeah, the fact that, Guru Patik has this sort of ability to sort of, sense the sort of history of Appa sort of directly here definitely sort of stands out. I don't know if we have, any other character that has had, such a strong spiritual connection with just sort of the world and the universe enough that they can sort of sense sort of like direct thoughts and emotions. I think that sort of stands out on his own, but maybe the fact that he is sort of so close with the sort of air nomads of past that he sort of was able to sort of develop this sort of ability here, especially as we consider him to be a non-bender or some sort of spiritual sort of guru of the time. So no, I think it's definitely stands out as a moment in this sort of episode, especially considering how involved he becomes later on in the series.
Next, he attaches a message for Aang to Appa's horn. And then he uses Appa's energy to sense where Aang is because they have such an incredible bond. So this is a really unique thing because they're effectively going back to like the swamp here, except there isn't the swamp to sort of channel it through. Instead, it's just him, I suppose, directly connecting to the literal spiritual connection between Aang and Appa to sense where they are. So it's really interesting because like that's one of the more kind of high-end spiritual techniques we've ever seen, and that like what other characters really equate to him, and it's like Hugh from the swamp because he's like enlightened according to that episode, and especially when it comes to the swamp itself and the banyan tree, he probably has something very similar going on there. But yeah, Guru Patik here with this really unique ability that, Toph kind of in Korra has something along these lines, again using the swamp. She can sense where her daughters are, so there is this kind of sense of like when you are spiritually attuned enough, you can just connect to anyone you have a connection with in that sort of a way. It's kind of similar to like, I suppose, in like, was it 219 when we get there, Aang being able to kind of sense what's happening to Katara, to know that he needs to go there. So it's not something we focus on too much, but it's a very unique ability overall, that spirituality goes to this kind of insane degree when you kind of have it to that degree. But what are your thoughts on this here? The connection spiritually of Appa and Aang.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the whole episode is showing the strength of their bond, right? They're lifelong companions and friends, from the first day that they met each other. So I think, it speaks to the strength of their connection that, Guru Patik is able to sort of connect the two of them sort of together. It doesn't look like it's like a direct sort of like, instant sort of locator, like he gets them to the city and of course, something happens where Appa gets distracted. But I think, just the fact that he's able to sort of, connect them into the range without any other sort of like medium to sort of connect them, like you mentioned before, like the swamp is what, other characters have used, which is already sort of like a spiritually sort of like enhanced location. But here, it's just the strength of the two characters being connected to each other over, the course of their lives, that he's able to sort of tap into that situation, which is, unique in itself, and makes you wonder sort of what other sort of, abilities he can use in that sort of form or fashion. And, just sort of how he can sort of teach that sort of going forward to Aang, and, how other people learn it as well. It definitely feels like it's a unique thing, even if it doesn't have sort of like a big play in things overall.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose the final thing with Guru Patik is, I suppose we maybe have to have a talk about his age, because he is 150 years old canonically, as far as we're aware. Now, admittedly, like that comes from like the old Nickelodeon website, so it's a weird kind of source of that kind of information, and like they don't say it maybe directly in the episodes, but like because of the way he talks about, I was a friend of like Yatso, it's like, oh yeah, well, it has to be in or around that, doesn't it? The question is obviously like, how's he lived that long? And I think they roughly gave an explanation that it's something along the lines of, because he is so spiritual, because he does like yoga and stuff like that, that this is how he has lived so long. We also do have the Kyoshi technique that, as far as we're aware, is not a bending technique. It's just sort of a control of your inner energy thing, where you can make yourself kind of locked into a specific point in time so you don't like age. It's hard to say like if he's using that same technique, or if it is just that this is what being spiritual and like active in the way he is through yoga to a certain degree can do for you in the Avatar world. What are your thoughts on Guru Patik and how, he's probably the one that like we have maybe don't have the full explanation for, but he kind of lives the longest. What are your thoughts on him?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. In the Avatar world, having characters that are, extremely old doesn't seem like, so far a far-fetched sort of idea that it can be sort of completely sort of implausible. Bearing in mind any sort of, loopholes or ideas or mess ups that happen where they sort of have to figure out how to give characters sort of like a older age just because, him being this sort of, spiritually sort of enhanced sort of character, that can almost sort of make sense to me. That's sort of like, someone who's in tune with their body enough, has this ability, to sort of control sort of their rate of aging, their rate of growth, if they're, sort of that in tune, and they have a need for it. Because, I'm sure many other characters who have reached a certain level of, sort of refinement in their bending and sort of their mastery over themselves in this sort of world could probably sort of like, achieve something similar to this if they sort of, wanted to. But like, where would be the sort of direct reason for that? Or, would there be sort of a goal for them that sort of learn that sort of technique here? And I don't know, it feels like Guru Patik out of anyone would, him having sort of already seen sort of visions of the future and stuff could have specifically, worked himself so that he could survive to this point in order to, sort of give the message to Aang. So I don't know, a spiritual character who's really in tune, that doesn't particularly seem sort of so far-fetched for me to live this long here, bearing anything else that he does to sort of keep himself mobile and agile, which even in this sort of, episode here, we see that he's pretty sort of, limber for someone who is sort of at his advanced age.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really interesting. I'd like more content with Guru Patik. Maybe it's possible to get it at some point, but very interesting character. We end this episode with Appa arriving in Ba Sing Se. Very dramatic music playing here as he flies in. He's got the letter, of course, on his horn. He lands, makes the footprint on the ground from the previous episode, and we find out that he's actually been drawn in by the whistle of Long Feng and the Dai Li, who are prepared for his arrival. Long Feng just kind of steps out, and in a second, he kind of inverts the ground underneath Appa, and the two of them are just kind of taken underground here. So it's a super powerful earthbending technique to just flip it all over that quickly. And this is how Appa was taken. So we know that to a certain degree, I guess he's being held underground somewhere in Ba Sing Se. Long Feng isn't lying when he says that he knows what's up with Appa. He was the one who directly captured him. So it's a really important reveal that we know that this is the case, and that the gang need to be careful around Long Feng because he's got so many conspiracies going on. But yeah, what are your thoughts on the final scene of this episode?
Yeah. I mean, this is, it's so sort of sad to see this sort of moment here, because it's like, oh, we got, sort of hope here, and he's going to find Aang in the city because he's connected to him, and then he just sort of gets sort of captured here, and sort of the whistle, which, for the most part has seen, sort of pretty handy sort of to have around, gets used in sort of the opposite way than we sort of might have thought it would get used here. So yeah, I think this is, it's a sad moment for Appa after everything that he's sort of gone through, but he is closer, he is closer, and Long Feng does know where he is, so there's a bit more sort of hope now.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, this pretty much perfectly sets things up for 217 up next, which is mostly a direct kind of sequel to 214, but it's definitely helped by these previous two episodes, seeing more kind of normal times, I guess, in Ba Sing Se, knowing what Appa's been through, so that his kind of big return when everything seems hopeless in the next episode is as impactful as it can possibly be. But we'll switch over to our final episode review for this episode of the podcast when we switch over to Korra. So we're right at the start of Book 3 Change. This time we're doing the second episode of the book, and that is K302 Rebirth. So this is a very interesting episode, of course, almost exclusively focused in on the start of the search around the world, basically, mostly the Earth Kingdom, for other airbenders and all the reports that are popping up. So we see the team setting off on their journey, and the first kind of terribly planned out attempts to get airbenders to kind of join up with them. While we also in the background have the formation of the the reformation of the Red Lotus team as well. Most of that happens here as well. So lots happens in this one. I think this is a really, really good episode. A great follow up to the premiere for book 3. I really like the airbender focus in this book especially, and this one does really, really stand out here. Kai is definitely one of the more memorable kind of new characters introduced this season, and we get that here. So I'm a big fan of this episode. I think there's a lot of good scenes. And what are your thoughts on Rebirth?
Yeah, no, I think this is a good one. I think it has a lot of, moving parts here. We get to see our characters go sort of on a journey, which is something that we sort of have wanted for Korra to go on. Even if this is sort of like a contained journey, it's not, sort of a huge one where it's just like forever and ever, and there's a sort of big sort of thing at the end of it. But here we get to see our main sort of characters here, travel around, experience different places. Things don't obviously work out for them in the way that they sort of intended, but they get to meet a lot of characters. We get some funny bits from some voices and stuff like here that we know. So no, I think this is a fun episode that does really sort of push the needle forward in sort of the overall things of the world, because there are new airbenders, and Tenzin and our group here want them to sort of, join up and sort of reform, something that's been lost for like a generation or two. But there's, obviously resistance to this, and they're going to have to figure out how to deal with it.
Mm-hmm. So we'll start with the kind of side plot of the episode, and that is Zahir, now that he is free, going after his teammates overall. So the first scene we get in the episode is him arriving at this kind of wooden prison, basically out at sea. This is where Ghazan is imprisoned. We see him arrive wearing the White Lotus outfit by speedboat. It looks like it's just the kind of shift change crossover that they've been expecting, but he arrives on his own, immediately attacks, and he's doing well on his own, but he just throws in a couple of rocks into Ghazan's cell, and immediately we see the reveal that he is a lava bender. And this is effectively our first proper reveal of lava bending, even though we knew about it prior to this. This is the first time, I think, where they have it fully in place in their minds that it's an advanced earth bending technique. There's no confusion about that anymore. This is what it is. Here's someone using it. These are special benders here that you're being introduced to, and here is a really clear way to show some of that. Lava Shuriken comes out, Ghazan frees himself, and they just effortlessly defeat the White Lotus members here, and the team is now 2. So very cool opening sequence here. This is the fun factor that the Red Lotus have. It's just that they get to be awesome in these fight scenes, while also having the kind of special abilities as well. What are your thoughts on the freeing of Ghazan?
Yeah, no, I think this is a really cool one. I mean, I think all the escape scenes are pretty fun here, but I think getting to see this one in sort of his sort of unique environment that they have for this one. I mean, we got to see Zahir's, and that was interesting in its own, but he didn't really have, at least they didn't think that he had any sort of bending that sort of would help him in that sort of situation here. But here you get to see how they at least attempted to counter Ghazan and sort of his abilities here, which we've seen in the past, so it's nothing sort of super sort of unique on its own, but the fact that it's all dedicated for one person shows you sort of the seriousness of the situation, so that when you get to the end of the episode and you get to hear sort of how powerful these really these characters are sort of together and individually, you start to get a bigger picture of why they're sort of in these situations that they are in.
Yeah, just the experience as you go through the episode, because you don't really know about the Red Lotus yet. You don't know how many members of the groups there are. Even just, it's another person in an individual prison. That's interesting. One guy in this, I guess, specifically crafted prison. That's interesting. And then when it goes on and there's another one in another more intricately crafted prison. What's the deal with these guys? And like you say, yeah, the scene at the end where we finally get the explanation from someone who actually knows what's happening here. It's pretty cool to hype up villains in this way, that you have Zuko freaking out about how powerful but we will get there. The next of the freeing of the Red Lotus scenes is we cut to this volcano prison next. And of course, it's Zahir and Ghazan attacking here. This is where we see Minghua is imprisoned, basically suspended over like an active volcano, to obviously keep the air kind of dry so she doesn't have any water. We see that she doesn't have any arms. But when they immediately come in and attack, they immediately spill a barrel of water over the top of her, and immediately she makes up for her lack of arms with these water arms that she quickly bends into position. And then she just does some of the most kind of impressive, like, speed, movement-based water bending that we see. And it's clear that now 3 of these really powerful benders are absolutely more than a match for the White Lotus guards all around here. There is a little bit more of dialogue between the group at this point where they're beginning to come together. She notes like, oh, I can't believe you two came to save me before we saved like your girlfriend, referring to Zahir. So there's a setup that, okay, the last member of the group is Zahir's girlfriend, and the idea that, okay, they needed to do it in this order because I guess she is the most dangerous of the group as well, is kind of an interesting thing given how impressive Ghazan and Minghua have been so far. So yeah, it continues a really strong introduction of these characters. There's always this cool factor of just specialized prison, specialized bending technique that's always cool to see in any material. But what are your thoughts on how Minghua is freed here?
Yeah, no, definitely another sort of a standout escape here for these, very sort of powerful characters and them sort of interacting in this sort of environment because they're, designed just for their to sort of like inhibit their sort of abilities here. But it looks like all they need is just a little bit of their sort of, element here. And even in this sort of harsh environment, they're able to sort of escape without any sort of issue here. Like you would think that, they would have this all set up with like, dry heat and everything so that any sort of water would almost sort of like immediately evaporate. But nope, she's able to sort of use just this one sort of barrel to sort of escape herself and to sort of, incapacitate or take out all of her sort of guards in this sort of instance here. So no, I think this is definitely really cool just to see sort of their skills here, and just to see that it seems like every new one that they get is just sort of like stronger and stronger in their sort of situation here. And there's one more that is potentially even more powerful.
Mm-hmm. And then right at the end of the episode, it's not following up with Zahir, but it's Zuko arrives at Minghua's prison basically to be informed that this is now basically the third of the group to be broken out. And he goes on this speech about how even one of these people on their own would be a threat. All of them together could like topple nations, basically. And it's even worse now that Zahir is confirmed to be an airbender, because he was already kind of a threat before, just as a non-bender. He then immediately heads off. He's asked, where are you going? And he knows what to do next because he knows where they're heading next. He asks the guard to be basically like, alert the Northern Water Tribe, their new chiefs, that their prison is going to be under attack. And also alert the Lin Beifong that the Avatar will need to be protected as well. And then we get the really cool reveal here. Zuko walks out, and what's waiting for him there? A fully grown dragon. He hops on his dragon, and he's heading for the Northern Water Tribe. It's a super cool reintroduction of Zuko into the series with older Zuko here, who actually knows what this group is up to, which is fascinating. And it's like, oh, how does he know them specifically? Was he part of like how they were captured in the first place? Which makes him all the more impressive, because if they're that powerful, how powerful was Zuko? When he took them out, type thing is the interesting thing. There's so many things to talk about in just this one scene, and this is I think one of the examples of like Korra didn't use the original kind of legacy characters in the perfect way. Maybe not all the time, but they did reveals like this, I think, particularly well, in that this scene was so hype. But what are your thoughts on the Zuko scene here at the end of the episode?
Yeah, I think it definitely sort of, amps up sort of the seriousness of these new characters here and sort of their abilities, as well as just sort of getting to see a character that we knew from before. I think is, seeing Zuko in this sort of context here, he's older, he's more mature, he has white hair, so he's aging, that sort of, makes us think back to sort of Iroh and everything that Iroh was able to do. So yeah, it definitely makes him seem, really cool, which I guess, you could say maybe some people feel a little bit let down when we do see sort of what happens with him, but he is old, he is sort of, not in his prime or anything like that, so that speaks to when we do get to see him in the prime, it should hopefully be pretty cool. At least that's the current theory and stuff like that. And especially with him having a dragon, I think that's, always something that sort of stands out considering there's so much history with the dragons and the Fire Nation and stuff like that. So the fact that he has one and, that's his sort of companion, I think that, definitely sort of stands out with his character and everything like that. So no, it definitely, speaks to that there's a lot of cool things that have happened to Zuko that we won't necessarily know about, but it's cool to sort of imagine, and maybe one day we'll get to see it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the big thing here is that, like, yeah, this is Zuko past his prime. I know some people have some issues and like, oh, why can't all the characters in Korra be like Boomy-esque, where they're like still absolute top tier at this age? But there seems to be a thing where like the really old characters who are still incredibly powerful, like they've done weird and special things to kind of keep themselves like that level of active. Whereas most of our group kind of has more aged in a normal way for the most part, highlighting that like it's not just the case where like in Avatar, if you're 70, you're just still in top condition type thing. But yeah, the big thing here definitely is the reveal of Druk, the dragon, who we still don't know a ton of information about. The RPG material tells us that Zuko met Druk when he was in his 20s at some point. So we probably would expect a somewhat young Druk to... Actually, no, he met Druk when Druk was already like an adolescent dragon. So, by the time we jump in and Zuko's maybe like 30 or something like that in the movie coming up, Druk should be pretty much like fully grown, or like not quite as fully grown as he is here. But still, it's fascinating because like we were kind of told in ATLA that, well, there's not really any other dragons except for Ran and Shaw type thing. So is this the egg type thing? The kind of purple dragon theory with the Sun Warrior egg or something like that. It's somewhat unclear. Will they explain it? We don't know. But it's a really cool moment, Zuko on a dragon. It's like, it's the right type of fan service to kind of do, I think, even though we still want a lot more explanations. But yeah, that's where this ends, with a setup for a more distinct fight going to happen around the last member of the group. But we'll cut over to the main kind of part of the episode, which is the kind of search for the airbenders. So we actually get some cool stuff here where we open this up with Asami arrives with a fully equipped new airship that they're going to use to search for the airbenders. So that's really cool that they just have their own private airship. The big thing that happens in the early scenes is just the idea of who is coming, who isn't coming. So we find out that Janora is going to go, but Iki and Milo are not. Kaya and Pema are going to stay behind with the help of, Milo and Iki to man the air temple island for if other people kind of arrive who have discovered that they have airbending. But basically most of the other characters are going to be going, except we do have to address that Mako seems very awkward. It doesn't want to come necessarily, but Korra can't convince him. It's Bolin who actually ends up convincing him, mainly with the idea of guilt tripping him with the idea of like, half of our family theoretically is in Ba Sing Se. What if we were to meet them and then I just have to tell our grandmother that you just didn't bother to come? So he comes mainly because of that, but also, as Korra said, he is a member of the team. She wants him there. They have to kind of do this all together. So he kind of reluctantly is going to go along with. But yeah, they have all the reports here on the map all across the Earth Kingdom for airbender kind of sightings. Basically that's the setup for what's happening here. What are your thoughts on this, the reveal of the big new airship and then the whole situation with Mako being too awkward to come?
Yeah, I mean, I think they definitely have the right sort of setup for this sort of journey and to do it in sort of style. I think this is better way of doing the journey than most of the other, ways that they've had in the past for other sort of avatars and stuff like that. So no, I think this is cool. It's a definitely sort of a modern way, modern-ish way of sort of traveling and doing things, and sort of, especially if they're going to hopefully be gathering a lot of people. Like this seems like this would be like an ideal way to get people and to not have them sort of like suffer or try to rough it or whatever as they get them all back to the temple in order to train them and stuff like that. So I think the idea is nice. They have the resources available to them, especially with Asami here. So no, I think this is definitely a nice sort of start setup for this. And I think I think it feels sort of on point that Mako feels sort of like a bit sort of awkward with the group now, considering everything that's sort of happened in the past, and just sort of Mako's character in general, especially over the last sort of bit that we've seen him. He kind of just sort of gets in these sort of ways here and needs to sort of be sort of reeled back into the group here. So no, I like that Bolin is able to sort of do this, sort of have like a little sort of like heart to heart here, even if it is sort of done in sort of Bolin's sort of like, typical sort of jokey, sort of amusing sort of way. I think, the point gets brought across here, and Mako can see that this really is sort of like a good sort of opportunity to travel here without, any other sort of cost or anything like that. He just has to figure out how to get around sort of Beifong.
Mm-hmm. The first stop is that we go to meet this man, Kuon, who has discovered he has airbending. And the kind of twist to this situation is that he is kind of, fully grown, full adult, has a full family, and there just seems to be some kind of crossed wires over like the approach from like Tenzin and Korra versus, you've just heard a report that someone is an airbender. This isn't a report, and also I would like to join you as well. And they've kind of gone into it with maybe the wrong expectations, because Tenzin fully is just like, I can't wait for you to join us at the air temples and stuff like that. Your family will understand why you're not around anymore. And there's just this real sense of like, oh, he's read the room very badly here. And it gets heated enough that they're actually told to leave. So it ends really, really badly the first time out. And you can see that, yes, why didn't anyone think that this was actually going to be the case? And I guess maybe to a certain degree, it's that idea of like, Korra's been prepared for like her journey as the Avatar her entire life. And then, Tenzin's been in like an air nomad his entire life. They're maybe not the best two people to kind of talk to about like, let's not rip a family apart maybe type thing. But it is an interesting topic that gets brought up here, because it's like, oh wait, how many people are we actually going to get if this is the way it is? That most of these people are going to already have their own lives. Are we going to get anyone at this point? That's kind of where it gets to. So what are your thoughts on the kind of slight twist, I suppose, that kind of happens here to create complications with rebuilding the kind of airbenders here?
Yeah, no, I think like you said, it's definitely, they coming at this from like a specific point of view here that, people would be really, enjoyed and enthralled, and sort of idea that the air nomads are back is something that, people really sort of want. But this hasn't been a thing for a while now. There's only been, this small group, who's all related to each other of air nomads and airbenders. So, the fact that there's more of them out there that have no sort of connection, is something that's going to take Tenzin and, Korra sort of a bit to sort of come around to this sort of thinking here. And this is really their first sort of instance of it, of where, these people don't have, this father of this family doesn't really have any sort of connection with air nomads or the culture. I mean, the fact that they had to travel, such a distance that they needed an airship, maybe would clue them in on this, but they're so sort of like laser focused on this sort of idea that they've sort of had in their minds. Tenzin, this has been his sort of thing for his whole life, right? And Korra, this is something that she knows about, and she knows the meaning of it, overall. But other people have their own sort of desires and wants and stuff like that. So yeah, it's definitely something to see sort of Tenzin come, straight forward with this. And this is, another character point for Tenzin. He had to learn how to deal with Korra and sort of her idea of airbending and what she sort of wanted to do. And she was all for it, but she still had her own sort of hangups for it. So now he's going to have to sort of learn this again with other people.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, from here it just kind of goes from worse to worse because we then montage basically through a bunch of other places and approaches here where we effectively just get across the idea of, again, Tenzin doesn't quite seem to see the problem here, and just it's a really quick rapid fire. He says kind of one thing about the air nomad culture that person will have to do, and immediately it's met with rejection. And so it's all this stuff like, oh, you'll have to shave your head, your best friend's going to be a big giant sky bison, and various other things about the air nomad culture that makes it very different to especially someone from like the Earth Kingdom. And the whole time through, he just never approaches this in the right way. And it's just failure after failure after failure. And when will they see kind of what the actual problem is and adjust their approach, which is where Korra decides she's going to take a tougher approach, which we'll get to in just a second. But the montage definitely kind of adds on to the more kind of nuanced scene from before to just highlight that, yeah, sometimes going in really strongly with, here's the very specific parts of our culture that's very different than the culture you've been a part of for however long you've been alive, that's not really going to be the best selling point to completely change your life around and go with them on this kind of mission that you haven't fully explained to everyone. So yeah, it's a bit of this kind of idealistic approach of like, they have this idea, this dream, they just think it'll all come together because it's meant to happen, but no, people have their lives and they kind of haven't quite considered that. But what are your thoughts on the failure montage here?
Yeah, I mean, it's played up for laughs the way that they do it here, but you definitely can see the real sort of frustration that Tenzin is having, especially by the time they get to sort of Korra attempting her own sort of method. I think it's funny because Tenzin, he's grown up in this culture. He's sort of been brought up with the idea of all the sort of values of air nomads and the ideas of how airbending works and stuff like that. So everything that he sort of picks, he's observant, so he's picking things that would sort of potentially be good for the people that he's interacting with. Like when he says the one about sort of like vegetarian and the dude's eating sort of meat, like those are points that he sees them as the benefit, but for people who haven't dealt with that at all their whole life, that's a complete sort of like 180 there, which is something that he, at this point in time, he doesn't really sort of understand that, just because that's just where he's sort of coming from. That's his sort of point of view. So, he has to sort of come to terms with this, and, he's interacting with new people and stuff like that at the same time. So he's, it's a bit of a journey and a bit of a sort of reverse sort of culture shock for him, interacting with these people and sort of trying to figure out sort of like, what would get them to sort of join, this sort of idea that you've had for forever and rebuilding this nation? And how is he going to have to sort of adapt to this sort of change, with different people who don't have exactly the same sort of values that he's sort of been brought up with? So it's interesting to get to see him to learn this sort of like over time, through this one and through the whole sort of season.
Mm-hmm. Next, Korra takes command of the mission here. She's going to do the next one. And she goes in with Mako and Bolin to this guy, Ryu. And what happens here is it's mainly Ryu's kind of personality, where he just doesn't kind of say too much. He just is like, I'm not interested, and just kind of doubles down on he really frustrates Korra to the point where Korra gets angry and basically just gets into an argument with him over actually convincing him to maybe do anything. But he actually is someone who's maybe in a position in his life where, like, hey, if you approach this in the right way, maybe you would be able to kind of get him on board. And he actually does end up joining them, but it's not here. It's sort of like kind of more off screen. He actually does kind of join them later. So it's an interesting one where Korra, of course, fails here because like that is not the right approach. either is just to literally grab the poor person and kind of take them, even if you are extremely frustrated with them. So it's just, again, the idea, yeah, they haven't thought about this more beyond just, it's destined to happen. Everyone will join up. Everyone will sign up. It'll be easy. Actually, no, they have no one so far except Boomy, who was already in from the start. Frustrating situation, but yeah, what are your thoughts on Korra's approach?
Yeah. I mean, Boomy, he was already sort of like adjacently involved with the culture, even if he wasn't taking on all the sort of like, journeys and stuff that Tenzin was on. He was at least sort of like aware of the culture and, sort of was brought up to it, to the degree that you could be from, someone who doesn't have sort of any sort of bending here. But yeah, for trying to get someone who is sort of apathetic to the whole sort of cause of the Air Nation, and the air nomads in general, Korra's approach is definitely not one that you sort of want to go to. And, it's funny, they play this one up for even more sort of laughs here because the mom is all sort of for it. Like, the slacker son who, needs some direction in his life. So this would almost be sort of the right thing to sort of have for him, going forward. And, eventually we do see that it sort of works out. But definitely the way that Korra was sort of trying to go for it was sort of like over enthusiastic in this one. It almost might have been better for like Tenzin to sort of lead this one, because he could have been sort of like more calm in this sort of situation here versus Korra's just sort of go for it here. So yeah, I think this, it definitely shows that there's a right approach and a right way to go about things here, and Korra definitely doesn't have it in this way, but it does speak to Korra's character, and this would be how she would attempt to do something in this sort of situation.
Mm-hmm. So next, a combination of Boomy and Bolin come up with the idea to put on a show, like showcase airbending in a way that will actually interest people to the point where they will direct airbenders to us rather than us kind of coming to them, that they would want to be involved in this thing because it's cool, fun, exciting, and not it's all about the kind of cultural changes that you'll have to kind of go through. So what ends up happening here is that they put on a show. Primarily it's like Tenzin and Korra showing off how cool airbending is, but then also we get to see Jinora as the kind of young prodigy, and also Boomy as the kind of new recruit, showing that you can control your abilities in just a few weeks. So that's kind of cool. And this actually creates a positive interaction with the crowd, and it looks like, yeah, word's going to spread, people will come towards them, and someone immediately appears. And this is the introduction of Kai. So Kai appears and it's just like, hey, I'm an airbender. I can kind of control my abilities, basically. I want to join. And it all seems a little bit too perfect given how badly everything's gone wrong so far. He seems like he just wants to get out of there immediately. He tells his tragic story about like being an orphan and having no one, and all this stuff that he's had to do to get it to bring him to this point, and he just wants to kind of go on this new stage of his life, and he seems to get everyone on board until the sheriffs arrive, and we'll get into this more in a second. But what are your thoughts on the airbending show and the initial introduction of Kai here?
Yeah, I really like this show. I think it's a good sort of showcase. I know, Tenzin is sort of like, I don't know, we'll see it and see how it goes here, but this definitely feels like sort of Bolin and sort of his element, his sort of showmanship sort of status here. So I think that's, it definitely plays up his sort of strength of character and what he wants to do. And I think, they get a pretty good crowd. I think, it would have been interesting if they would have done this in one of the other sort of, places where there was even more sort of people and it wasn't sort of so sort of like out there on sort of the outskirts, which is sort of what this sort of place sort of feels like to me. But no, I think this is definitely a sort of fun way, Mako being involved with this and sort of being, not really a good sort of actor. That's sort of like on key for how he would sort of do things. But, the result is good. They get people sort of watching. It's definitely sort of a unique thing because, how many people really sort of see airbenders unless they're in sort of, Republic City, right? So, even in Republic City, there's only a handful of them up until recently. So, where's sort of the experience there? So I think, it has a novelty factor to it as far a bending sort of ability. So no, I think I think that's a good way to go about it. And, it's cool that they do sort of get one sort of right up from the beginning here, even if it seems like it's a little bit sort of too easy here. But I think it's interesting that, Kai already has some sort of ability to control sort of airbending, which, is that because he's young? Is that because he's using it for other reasons that we don't quite know fully yet? I don't know, but I think that's cool that he has, some level of sort of competency and sort of control over it, whereas before we've seen people who have been sort of completely sort of bewildered by these new sort of abilities, which probably makes sort of more sense to people who are sort of more sort of, out there with these sort of abilities and can't control them. But I don't know. I wonder if it's sort of like a age thing or a mentality thing that gives, certain people better initial sort of control over these newfound abilities that they have.
Hmm. So yeah, the sheriff then arrives. Cora fights them, and right as we get to the end of the fight, she says something. The sheriff reacts, and suddenly it becomes clear that wait, they're the actual kind of like police force here. They are honestly after Kai. They call him a thief. The truth ends up coming out that oh, his tragic story that he told was a complete lie, and actually he was adopted by a family who do actually care for him, but he stole their valuables from them. And so it's like, oh no, he's actually done something properly wrong here and is trying to get away by joining the group. So they're left with this kind of choice to make of, do they not take him on board because he's done this really bad thing, or do they feel that they can actually turn him around, that joining the airbenders, the new air nomads, would be good for him. And so Cora makes the choice here. She's going to take him in. She feels that Kai just needs some guidance. And then we get the idea that Mako, who actually caught Kai from running away, is also going to keep an eye on him. We also get introduced to the other interesting detail here, which is that Janora immediately has a crush on Kai. So a lot of interesting dynamics kind of happening here. This is where I like that Mako has come along, that like he's the one who like saw through a little bit of this, because he's been in Kai's position before. He knows this sort of approach, the way you have to act sometimes to survive. So he's completely laser focused in, whereas Bolin is a little bit too enamored with the opportunity to be the big brother for once. But it's a fun scene. I like getting to see Cora make this kind of big choice of trying to see the good in him, that this will be good for him to, be in this environment rather than just getting taken away and being put in jail at such a young age. It's an interesting decision for this character, because I think he goes on to be kind of one of my favorite minor characters from Korra. So it's interesting where he actually started off. But what are your thoughts on the truth about Kai here?
Yeah, I think it's definitely something of note to see sort of this character that comes from sort of this, sort of underbelly sort of upbringing here, and, one who potentially had a chance to, sort of better his life just with sort of the normal sort of circumstances of things, but sort of went a sort of different route here. So I don't know. It's something, it stands out of his character, makes him sort of unique. It makes it sort of all the more worthwhile when he does, eventually fully sort of embrace sort of the better way of doing things, because we know he had this, little bit of a shady past from his upbringing, right? And I think, that also plays into Mako and Bolin, right? Like they had this sort of history where they had to do what they had to do to sort of survive here, where, for Kai, it's interesting because it seems like maybe he didn't necessarily have to do that, but we don't really know sort of his full sort of history backstory as far as that goes. So, there's more to him that meets the eye, which makes him a more interesting character. So yeah, I think he definitely does sort of turn out for me as well, one of my more sort of favorite sort of minor characters. And just the fact that he's, he becomes pretty good at airbending as well, I think, makes him, all the more better for it.
Mm-hmm. So that is, for the most part, the end of the episode. I think I'll just end us off with perhaps maybe a discussion on perhaps what should have been the approach from Tenzin, Korra, and the whole team to actually maybe get people on board initially. It's a tough one overall, because they highlight the obvious challenges of it to a certain degree. For me, maybe I feel they maybe should have highlighted a bit more of the historical kind of point a little bit, that like, hey, Tenzin is Aang's son. With what happened with harmonic convergence and the fact that there are other airbenders, that this allows for like the previous Avatar, Aang's dream to kind of become a reality. Like one of the nations which has been effectively gone for, like, as they say, nearly 200 years. You people have an opportunity to kind of help rebuild that if you want. I suppose it's one of those things where, like, that works if you maybe get all the new airbenders together as a group and kind of give them that kind of story. But something along those lines could have been a little bit interesting. They kind of get there in the end with the showcase when, like, Bolin introduces, like, Tenzin and highlights that he is actually a particularly famous person in the world. But just hitting that point home a little bit stronger, that this is why Tenzin and Korra are so passionate, is because it is about the rebirth of a nation that was lost, basically. Otherwise, I think probably it is just a bit of a sense where, like, they went into all of these meetings just assuming they'd get what they want, and they didn't maybe assess the idea of, like, ooh, this person's, like, in their 40s, 50s, has a full family. I don't think they're going to want to do this, so let's actually just approach this more in the idea of organizing some training lessons with airbending so you don't, like, hurt anyone with your ability, so you at least come out of it with control over it, and then maybe, like, here's a little bit of air nomad philosophy, just because it is now kind of part of who you are to a certain degree. Just a more subtle approach rather than the strong arm that they maybe kind of had a little bit. But what do you think would have been a better tactic to maybe get people on side a bit?
Yeah, no, I think the sort of showing what airbending can do, I think would have been a good sort of approach, seeing, sort of showing how useful it is. Because, I mean, these people who are sort of got these abilities now, like, they weren't benders before, right? So, like, they don't, even the idea of bending in itself, other than, the fact that, it's part of this world and that they have that as far as, how things have operated for, X amount of years, showing how that can sort of be useful for sort of their current lives. Like, if you're a farmer, how that can sort of, help you in that regard, or, I don't know, any sort of way that it can be sort of to enhance your current sort of way of living, along with the idea of training and getting some sort of philosophy in there, might have been a good way to sort of go about it. I think, as we've said, the heavy-handed approach obviously wasn't going to work, because you can't sort of go all in on something that you don't even sort of, like, understand to any sort of regard. So I think the idea, like you're saying, of the historical importance, sort of playing off of the idea of Aang and sort of what he meant for the world, if you can get that into anybody who has that sort of, like, compassion or empathy, could have been something that you could at least sort of lead in with as you sort of, delve into some of the sort of other ideas of the culture and stuff like that. But yeah, definitely going with all the sort of aspects of the sort of culture that, these other people have no idea about, definitely wouldn't necessarily work in that sort of regard here. So no, I think I like the idea of sort of, like, training them a bit, giving them an idea of how it can be useful to them, in the now, would have been a good approach for, sort of learning, airbending on the future. And then, maybe inviting them to sort of Republic City, saying you have an all expense paid trip or something like that. Like, they have an airship now, like, why not have it come back out and get them and then bring them to the Air Temple Island so they can actually sort of experience things firsthand, or bring them to any of the other sort of temples that are closer to them so they don't have to travel as far if they're, from the completely other side of, the Earth Kingdom or something like that.
Yeah, I didn't, like, even, like, say, for instance, with, like, Kuon, the fact that, like, they never even considered the idea of, like, well, why not just bring the whole family, like, keep them together? Like, is that a problem? Like, as such, doing things that way. But I don't know. It's an interesting one. Like, obviously, we'll come back to this as a plot point. It does get a little bit put on hold. Like, there's a part of, obviously, the next two episodes about kind of getting airbenders back as well, but the direct how we approach training them doesn't really get approached until, like, episode 7, I think it is, original airbenders. So we'll have times later on in the season to come back to some of this stuff, but yeah, this is a very, very fun, enjoyable episode. The crazy important action with the villains, and then the very fun kind of character stuff of, like, yeah, the failed attempts to get the new airbenders is very, very good. But yeah, that's where we're going to wrap things up for this podcast. Next podcast, the way we're going to do this is I believe we switch over and we're going to be doing 2 Korra episodes and 1 Avatar episode, because of course Lake Laogai and the Avatar side of things is quite an important episode, so we want to do that on its own. And on the Korra side of things, 3 and 4 from season 3 are basically like a 2-parter with the Earth Queen, so I think it's best to do them together. So that's going to be a fun group of episodes next time on the podcast, which also I suppose we should mention here, like, this is to a certain degree the end of an era, because this is highly likely to be the last podcast we record over Skype, which is what we've done with like every podcast for the last like 13 years of the podcast. Every single one has been done through Skype, but Skype is shutting down in like a week, just over a week. So we will have to find somewhere else to record the podcast, which will be fine. We'll organize it, but it's just an interesting behind the scenes thing of just that, like, oh yeah, it's been a long time. It's been just the go-to every single time, but now it's just going to be shut down. Any thoughts on this, the podcast legacy on Skype?
Yeah, no, that's funny, the fact that we've had it going for that long, and it's been a pretty convenient way of doing it, especially when we used to use the Skype recorder and everything like that, and how we were able to connect with people and send messages and stuff like that. So yeah, it's a bit sad to see it sort of go here, but that, I guess, that's sort of how tech goes over time.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I guess we'll reveal to you next time we record what way we're recording the podcast somehow. But yeah, that will be a fun one when we get there. Hopefully we'll have more kind of maybe positive news. We'll have maybe confirmation that the Paramount stuff at Annecy is actually happening, or just a sign that something's actually happening, because it is getting a bit frustrating that it feels like every opportunity something's about to happen, not just yet. And we've been waiting a very long time, so it's just, when's it actually going to kick off? Hopefully soon. But yeah, otherwise that's been episode 289 of the Avatar Online podcast. It's been myself and Greg. Thanks for listening, and bye.
Bye-bye.